My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 61 years old, and I thought I knew the man I married. Russell and I had been together for 38 years, married for 35 of them. To everyone on the outside, we looked like any old couple who had weathered the years together, quiet, stable, predictable. We had our routines, our rituals, our favorite takeout places. We never made a scene, never raised our voices in public, and rarely had arguments worth remembering. I thought that meant we were lucky, that we had a peace many people our age didn't find. But that peace shattered the day I opened his office. It happened 2 weeks after his funeral. He died in his sleep, just like that. One minute we were brushing our teeth side by side. The next morning, I was waking up next to someone who wasn't breathing. I still can't explain the kind of silence that follows a death like that. It's not just the absence of a voice, it's the absence of motion, the way the air feels heavier, the way even the dog, Toby, sat and stared at the front door for hours like he expected him to walk in. Everyone told me to take it slow, to not go through his things right away. They said, grieve first, let the dust settle. But the dust wasn't settling, it was suffocating me. His office had always been locked. That was his space, as he put it. I never questioned it much. Russell worked from home, consulting spreadsheets, the kind of work I didn't pretend to understand. I respected his privacy the way he respected my garden or my reading chair in the sunroom. Still standing outside that door, I now felt something I hadn't felt in decades: unease. The kind that makes your hand hover just a second too long over a doorknob. I had found the key in the back of his sock drawer, a single small silver key on a worn leather fob. For a man who loved order, it seemed hastily hidden. I hesitated for a long moment, not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because some part of me already knew I would never see him the same way again once I turned that lock. And I was right. The moment I opened that door, the smell hit me first: paper, old cologne, dust, and something else, something faintly sweet like faded perfume. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight. His desk sat untouched, everything neatly in place. But the walls were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them, and every single one was of me, sleeping, me in bed, me on the couch, me in the back seat of the car on road trips, me with my mouth slightly open, arms cradling a book I dozed off reading, me when I was 29, me at 42, me last year. I couldn't breathe. Some were black and white, others were color prints from cheap disposable cameras. And then the more recent ones, crisp digital shots, all labeled in tiny handwriting on the back. Evelyn, 3:17 a.m. Evelyn, nap on porch, July 2006. Page after page, frame after frame, not a single photo of us together. No pictures of birthdays or vacations, just me, always asleep. I backed out of that room like it was on fire. My heart thundered in my ears. Was this obsession? Was it love? Was it control? I didn't know. I still don't know. But I do know this. I was married to a man for nearly 4 decades, and I didn't have the faintest idea who he really was. And that's where my story begins. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Looking back, I now realize just how much I wanted to believe in the version of my life I'd created. To the outside world, Russell and I were what people politely called solid. We were the couple others pointed to and said, they've made it. We didn't fight in public. We hosted predictable holiday dinners. Our lawn was always trimmed, and our tax returns were always filed on time. In every photograph, we were side by side, smiling in that muted, rehearsed way couples do after years of posing together. We weren't passionate. We weren't cold either. We were steady, quiet. There's a kind of comfort in that, especially as you get older. You tell yourself that a peaceful life is a good one, even if that peace sometimes feels like still water, undisturbed but also unmoving. Russell loved routines. Every morning at 6:30, he'd make exactly 1 cup of coffee, dark roast, no sugar, and sit by the kitchen window with the newspaper. Not the digital version, The real paper, folded neatly like his father used to do. I always thought that was sweet, a little old-fashioned maybe, but endearing. He'd hand me my tea without asking because he already knew how I liked it. One sugar, tiny splash of milk. We'd sit in silence for a while. Sometimes he'd read headlines out loud. I'd nod. Other times, we'd watch the dog stretch out on the kitchen rug, chasing dreams with little paw twitches. It wasn't thrilling, but it was ours. On weekends, I gardened my little corner of life. He never interfered, not with my dahlias, or my tomatoes, or the tiny rosemary bush that barely held on through winter. Russell would watch from the porch, sometimes sipping his coffee like a man admiring a quiet painting. Occasionally, he'd bring me water or hold the gate open when I brought in soil. He didn't say much, but I never felt ignored, just gently left alone. We weren't affectionate the way some couples are. There were no spontaneous kisses, no hand-holding in public. But he'd put a light jacket over my shoulders if it got cold. At dinner parties, he'd fill up my gas tank without telling me. He always made sure there was a fresh bar of soap in my shower. I told myself these were the ways he showed love, quiet gestures, not loud declarations. Our daughter, Mara, used to ask if we were ever romantic. I'd laugh and say, romance fades, stability lasts. And I believed that. I really did. There were sacrifices, of course. I gave up teaching when Mara was born. Russell said it made more sense financially, and I didn't question it. He worked hard, paid the bills, kept the roof over our heads. I managed the home, schedules, birthdays, family events. We were a team. That's what I told myself every year. Let my own wants fall to the bottom of the list. Even now, it's hard to explain just how much I trusted the life I had. I didn't go through his drawers. I didn't ask what he did for hours in his office. I didn't pry into his late-night emails or his tax folders. That wasn't our dynamic. I gave him space, and I assumed he gave me honesty in return. I was the type of wife who didn't snoop, the kind who chalked up his distant moods to stress, aging, or blood pressure medication. I didn't push. I didn't accuse. I filled in the blanks with kindness and assumed he did the same for me. For years, that seemed enough. We had our rhythms: Sunday meatloaf, Wednesday crossword, Friday leftovers. Even after Mara moved out and the house got quieter, we still moved around each other like two dancers who'd been doing the same steps for decades. We even had inside jokes. When I couldn't remember where I left my glasses, he'd say, "Have you checked the freezer again?" Because once, years ago, I'd found them in there. After a long day, I'd roll my eyes, call him a smart aleck, and we'd both smile. So yes, I thought I knew my husband. I thought a quiet house meant a peaceful heart. I thought a locked door was just a preference, not a secret. I thought love was a long road paved with shared habits, mutual respect, and the comfort of predictability. But love, it turns out, isn't always what you think it is, and sometimes silence doesn't mean peace. It means there's something you're not supposed to hear. It was 2004, the year Mara graduated high school. I remember it clearly because we had just come back from a celebratory dinner. Russell had insisted on taking us to a fancy steakhouse downtown, not the kind of place we normally went, but he said she deserved it. I was proud of him for that. He even wore a tie, which was rare. That night, we were all in good spirits. Mara was glowing, talking about college and dorm life and how nervous she was about making friends. I remember looking at Russell across the table and thinking, we did it. We raised a kind, smart young woman together. But that feeling didn't last long. The next morning, I was doing my usual Sunday routine, gathering laundry from around the house. Russell was out front trimming the hedges, and I figured it was a good time to finally tackle the pile of clothes that had been growing in the guest room closet. As I walked past his office, I noticed the door was cracked open, just barely enough that I could see a light on inside. That alone was odd. He never left the light on, and the door was always locked, always closed. I assumed he must have forgotten to shut it tightly when he went outside, so I knocked gently and pushed it open just to grab the coffee mug I could see sitting on the desk. One step inside, that's all I took, and I heard it, his voice from behind me. "Evelyn, what are you doing?" I turned, startled. He had come in through the back door and must have seen me from the hallway. "Oh, just grabbing your mug," I said, holding it up like a white flag. "You left the door open." He stepped forward and gently took the mug from my hand, but his eyes didn't soften. They stayed sharp, alert. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't go in there," he said, not angry but firm, controlled, final. I blinked, confused. "I was just trying to help." He paused, then he gave me a small, polite smile. "I know, but I keep some sensitive documents in here consulting clients. It's best that room stays private." Sensitive documents, consulting clients, the same vague explanation he'd always given about his work. I didn't understand any of it, and I never pushed for details. I'd always respected his space. Still, something about the way he said it, about the way he hovered until I backed out of the room, made me feel like I had crossed a line I didn't know existed. I laughed it off. "All right, Mr. Mysterious, I'll stick to the laundry room from now on." He chuckled politely, but even then, he didn't turn his back to me until the door was shut. Then came the sound of the lock, a soft click, but loud enough that I felt it in my chest. That was the first time I felt unwelcome, like a stranger in my own home. It was just a moment, just one of those odd little things married people brush off. I told myself he was probably dealing with sensitive tax forms or legal contracts, that maybe I'd embarrassed him by being too curious. But the feeling stuck. A few weeks later, I tried to bring it up again, gently over dinner. "Russell, do you ever think about working in a co-working space? It might be nice to get out of the house." He barely looked up from his plate. "I like my office. It's quiet." And that was that. No argument, no opening, just a wall. Looking back, that moment was the first crack in the version of our life I'd constructed in my head, a small fracture in the foundation. At the time, I chalked it up to the stress of parenting, of aging, of two people simply needing a little space. But now I know that wasn't space. That was secrecy, and it had already started growing roots. After the office incident, something shifted, not in a dramatic way, in that there were no fights, no slammed doors, no whispered phone calls in the dark. That would have been easier to spot, easier to name. Instead, what crept in was something slower, quieter, and much harder to prove. It was the kind of shift you can only feel when you know someone as well as I thought I knew Russell, like the difference between silence and indifference, between stillness and distance. At first, I told myself it was me. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe after years of marriage, it was natural to feel disconnected from time to time. Couples fall into patterns. That's what everyone says. But the patterns were starting to feel more like traps. We'd sit across from each other at the dinner table, but the conversation thinned. He stopped asking about my day, my garden, my book club. When I spoke, he'd nod, maybe murmur a soft "that's nice," and go back to his plate. His eyes barely met mine anymore. He didn't seem angry or distracted, just uninterested. Mara came over. She noticed it too. "Is Dad okay?" she asked one Sunday after lunch. "He seems kind of flat." I shrugged and smiled too brightly. "He's tired. He's been working hard." But the truth was, I hadn't been inside his world in years. I didn't know if he was working hard. I didn't even know who his clients were. I hadn't seen a contract, a business card, or an invoice in forever. And yet, every time I passed by his locked office, I could hear the gentle hum of his old printer or the muffled rustle of papers. Once, I knocked to ask if he wanted lunch. There was a pause, then his voice almost startled me. "Leave it by the door, please. Leave it by the door." I remember standing there holding a plate of grilled cheese and tomato soup, staring at the closed door like I was a hotel maid delivering room service to a guest I wasn't allowed to speak to. That's how I began to feel like staff in my own home. I cooked, I cleaned, I kept things running, and in return, I received routine politeness and a familiar outline of the man I married, but not the man himself. The intimacy vanished too, though we never spoke of it. That part of our marriage had faded over the years, but now it felt like it had been erased completely, not because of aging or health, but because he was somewhere else entirely. I just didn't know where. Even our dog, Toby, picked up on it. He used to wait at the door when Russell came home, tail wagging, but more and more he began curling up at my feet instead, watching that office door with quiet suspicion. There were other little things. He stopped joining me on Sunday drives, stopped sitting beside me during movies, preferring instead to watch them on the little TV in the office alone. He didn't laugh at my jokes anymore. And when I cried during a particularly moving part of a novel I was reading, he didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't react. But perhaps the clearest sign came on our 35th wedding anniversary. I had planned something simple, a dinner at our favorite seafood place and a walk down by the water afterward, something we hadn't done in years. I wore the same blue dress I'd worn the night he proposed, even curled my hair the way he used to like. When he saw me, he didn't say a word, not one compliment, not one smile. We sat at the restaurant eating crab cakes in silence, while the young couple beside us clinked wine glasses and whispered across their table. I watched them and felt like I was staring through a window into a life I used to live. That night, he went to bed early, alone, and I stayed up staring at the shadows in the living room, wondering when I had stopped being seen. I wasn't angry yet, not really. I was lonely, and I was slowly beginning to understand that being in the same house with someone doesn't mean you're not alone. It just means you're close enough to feel how far apart you really are. It happened at Clara's retirement party. My sister, 3 years younger, always the one who sparkled in a room. Clara had been a high school principal for over 20 years, and the entire community turned out to celebrate her. Former students, teachers, even the mayor came to shake her hand. It was a beautiful event held in the same gym where she used to announce snow days and graduation speakers. I was proud of her, truly. Clara had worked hard her whole life, but as I stood there in the corner of the reception hall holding a lukewarm cup of punch, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong, not because of anyone else, but because of Russell. He had insisted on coming even though I'd given him every out. "You don't have to go," I said gently that morning. "You don't even know most of the people there." But he looked at me, shrugged, and said, "I'll drive." The ride over was quiet, not tense, just hollow. We didn't talk, no music, just the sound of the road and the occasional sigh from him, as if the very act of attending a celebration drained him. When we got there, Clara rushed over, wrapping me in a warm, genuine hug. She always smelled like cinnamon and books. "You came," she beamed. "I was hoping you would." Russell stood behind me, hands in his coat pockets. "Nice turnout," he said, his voice flat. Clara gave him a polite smile, then was swept away by a wave of people calling her name. Inside, the room buzzed with laughter and memories. Clara's coworkers shared speeches. There were slideshows, stories about her impact, even a little karaoke. Later in the evening, I kept glancing at Russell, trying to read his mood. He hadn't touched his food. He kept checking his watch. Then came the moment one of Clara's friends, a teacher named Rhonda, walked up and said with a warm smile, "So Evelyn, what are you up to these days? Still writing your poems?" I smiled. It had been years since I shared them with anyone, but yes, I still wrote little pieces in the margins of notebooks, in the backs of library receipts, even on napkins. I shrugged. Here and there, nothing serious. "Oh, don't be modest," Clara said from across the table. "You used to write the most beautiful pieces in college. I still have the one you wrote for Mom's birthday." I blushed, feeling seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. I opened my mouth to speak, and that's when Russell cut in. He chuckled loud enough for everyone at the table to turn toward him. "Oh, Evelyn writes all right, mostly grocery lists and notes about where she put her glasses." There was a ripple of awkward laughter. Someone tried to politely smile. I froze. He kept going. "If you want a haiku about which light bulbs to buy, she's your girl." That one got a bigger laugh. I forced a tight smile, heat rushing to my face, my throat tightened. I looked down at my plate, willing the moment to pass, but it didn't. It hung there, heavy, sticky, like something spilled that no one wanted to clean up. Clara looked at me, concerned, but didn't say anything. I shook my head lightly, mouthing, "It's fine." But it wasn't, because that moment, that tiny careless jab, told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't just ignored. I wasn't just invisible. Was a punchline he didn't see me as a woman with thoughts, dreams, and years of quiet contributions. He saw me as background noise, as someone who existed to keep the shelves full and the lights on, and he had no problem letting everyone else see it too. On the drive home, I stared out the window. He didn't apologize, didn't mention it, just asked if we had any milk left in the fridge, as if he hadn't just taken something delicate inside me and flattened it in front of a room full of people. I didn't cry, not that night. I just lay in bed wide awake, listening to him snore beside me and realizing that somewhere along the way, the man who once said I had the voice of a sunrise now treated me like the furniture in his life. And the worst part? I had let him. The days after Clara's party felt like fog. I moved through them the way one might walk through a dream that's lost its color. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt right anymore. I still made Russell's breakfast, still folded his shirts the way he liked, still picked up his prescription from the pharmacy every third Friday, but something inside me had shifted, and I couldn't pretend anymore that I hadn't felt it. The humiliation from that night kept replaying in my head, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was so casual, like breathing for him. That's what made it worse, that it cost him nothing to make me feel small. I started waking up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because lying in bed beside him made me feel trapped. I'd sit at the kitchen table in the dark, cradling a lukewarm mug of tea, watching the first signs of morning slip through the blinds. The dog would curl up near my feet, like even he knew something was off. I didn't want a confrontation. I didn't want to fight. I didn't even want an apology anymore. What I wanted was distance, not the physical kind, but the kind that would let me feel like myself again, whoever that even was. So I started finding small ways to retreat. I turned the guest room into a sewing space, told him I wanted to take up quilting again, though I hadn't touched a needle in years. He didn't object, barely reacted actually, just said, "Make sure you close the vents. That room gets cold." That was Russell's way of granting permission, not support, not interest, just logistical notes on how I should proceed. I began spending entire evenings in that room, not sewing, not really, just sitting, thinking. I pulled out old journals I hadn't opened in a decade, reread my poems. Some were embarrassingly sentimental, but others made me feel proud, like someone had once lived in me who had a voice, a sharp mind, and something to say. I missed her. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store and found Russell's office door wide open. It was a mistake. I knew that immediately. He must have stepped away without thinking. My heart skipped. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at that darkened doorway, the edge of his desk barely visible, and I did nothing. I didn't walk in. I didn't look because I was too tired to peel back another layer of what he might be hiding. I was still bruised from the first time I had crossed that threshold years ago and the wall he'd built between us since that night. I made a decision. I would leave, not in a dramatic suitcase by the door kind of way, but slowly, quietly, the way smoke drifts from a candle after it's been snuffed out. I spoke to Clara a week later over tea in her sunroom. Her retirement had given her a calm I envied, a woman at peace with her past, curious about her future. I didn't tell her everything, just that I was tired, that I didn't recognize my own life anymore. She reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said the simplest, most painful thing anyone had said to me in a long time: "You don't have to stay invisible." It wasn't that Russell kicked me out. He would have been content if I stayed until the end of time, folding laundry, leaving meals at his door, vanishing into the background like wallpaper. But I couldn't do it anymore. So I told him one ordinary Tuesday morning that I was going to visit Mara for a while. She lived 4 hours away in a townhouse with her fiancé, David. I said I needed the change, some airtime to think. Russell looked up from his oatmeal and nodded. Let me know if you'll be back for the taxes. That was it, no protest, no sadness, not even confusion, just his usual pragmatic detachment, like I'd said I was going to the dry cleaner. So I packed a single suitcase, left a note with the dates I'd be gone, and walked out the front door. The wind was cold on my cheeks, but it felt like something real was finally touching me again. He didn't call that night. He didn't call the next day, and deep down, I wasn't surprised. I was already gone long before I ever walked out the door, but something inside me, something buried and nearly forgotten, had stayed behind, not to wait. To watch, because I knew, without knowing how I knew, that the truth was still inside that house, and one day I would open the right door. Mara's guest room was painted light green with white curtains and smelled faintly of vanilla from a plug-in air freshener by the door. It was clean, warm, and quiet, but it didn't feel like home. It felt like I had stepped into someone else's life, a life still full of plans, cluttered with energy and motion. I was 61, sitting in a house I didn't decorate, sleeping in a bed I didn't choose, listening to my daughter and her fiancé laugh through the walls while I stared at the ceiling. It wasn't that they were unkind. Mara was generous, doing even in that slightly strained way children are when they sense their parents are unraveling. Do you want to come with us to the farmer's market? No, thank you. David and I were going to rewatch that old Cary Grant movie tonight. You love that one, don't you? I'm okay. You two enjoy. They tiptoed around me like I was made of glass, and I couldn't blame them. I felt like I might shatter if anyone touched me the wrong way. My days blurred. I didn't drink tea. I opened books I couldn't focus on, watched the sky change color through the window. Sometimes I wrote short phrases in my notebook, not poems, just fragments of thoughts. What do you do with a life that was mostly performance? When did I start living in parentheses? Would he have noticed if I never came back? I had never felt more alone, and that loneliness wasn't just about Russell. It was about myself, about how I had given away years to the idea that loyalty meant invisibility, that love required sacrifice without question, that keeping the peace was more important than being seen. One morning, I stood in the shower and let the water run cold. I didn't move, just stood there, arms crossed over my chest, letting the icy stream hit the base of my neck until my teeth chattered. I wanted to feel something sharp, something that would break through the numbness. Later that night, I sat on the floor beside my suitcase. I had opened it to repack, not to go home, but just to do something, anything. I found a scarf in the side pocket, one Russell had given me 5 years ago, a soft, deep burgundy, still folded with care. I held it to my face and inhaled, expecting to feel something. I didn't. No warmth, no memory, just fabric. And that was when I truly hit bottom, because it finally occurred to me I had spent my entire adult life trying to create meaning in things he did not care about. Gifts, gestures, glances. I had built a shrine out of crumbs. I began to cry, not loud sobs, but something quieter and deeper, a kind of weeping that starts in the stomach and leaks out through the eyes in silence. I covered my mouth with my hands and rocked slightly back and forth on that bedroom floor, afraid that if I let the sound out, I wouldn't be able to stop. Mara must have heard something, a creak, a gasp, I don't know, but she came into the room slowly, carefully, and knelt beside me. "Mom," she whispered. I shook my head. I didn't want comfort. I didn't deserve it. I had let this happen. I had let him happen. She didn't say anything else, just sat there. That silence, that kind silence, was what held me together. The next morning, I got up before sunrise. Wrapped in my old gray sweater, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees and watched the sky turn pink. And that was the first moment I felt it, not peace, not hope, but anger. A flicker of it, quiet but unmistakable. It didn't rage, it pulsed. I didn't know where it would take me yet, but I knew it meant I was still alive inside somewhere, buried beneath years of accommodation and disappointment. I was still in there. That's when I knew I had to go back home. Not to him, but to the house. There was something waiting for me there, not closure, not yet, but truth, and I was finally ready to face it. When I pulled into the driveway of our home, my home, 3 weeks later, it was raining, a soft, steady drizzle that clung to the windshield like a veil. The front porch light was still working, set on its automatic timer, illuminating the empty step where Russell used to place packages as if he were expecting a parade of deliveries we never actually received. I sat in the car for a while, gripping the steering wheel. I was both guest and ghost. This was the house where I had memorized every creak of the floorboards, where I had arranged flowers for 25 Thanksgivings and cried silently in the laundry room more times than I could count. It should have felt familiar, but instead, it felt staged, as if I were walking into a house someone else had prepared to look like my life. Toby, our old golden retriever, wagged his tail when I walked in but didn't bark. Even he seemed quieter, more cautious, as if he too had learned to lower his expectations. The house was just as I had left it, shoes lined by the door, my tea mug still in the drying rack, Russell's book on the coffee table, a bookmark sticking out like a tongue. I wandered slowly from room to room, not cleaning, not organizing, just looking, noticing, searching for what I didn't know until I reached the hallway. That door, his office, was closed as always. The key I remembered was still in my jewelry box. I had moved it there long ago, the way people place sharp things out of reach, but not out of memory. My breath caught as I walked down the hall. The air was stale. Still, I opened the box, pulled out the small silver key, and returned to the door. It clicked open like it had just been locked yesterday. Inside, nothing had changed. At first glance, the room was dim, blinds drawn tight, the desk was tidy, the bookshelf neat, but I didn't go to the desk. I turned to the wall and saw them, photographs, dozens, then hundreds. I stepped further in, heart thudding, eyes slowly adjusting. Photos of me, all of me, sleeping, me on the living room couch with a throw blanket tucked under my chin, me in bed with one arm draped over the pillow, me in the passenger seat of the car, head tilted, mouth slightly open, me younger in my 30s. Me last year, me from every angle, always asleep. Some were framed, some were taped, some were stacked in labeled boxes. 1991, 1995, 1996, 2000, Evelyn Portnaps. I felt dizzy. There were no notes, no explanations, just rows of images, dates scrawled in Russell's neat, emotionless handwriting. I sank into the chair by the desk, hands trembling, staring at the wall. It wasn't just the volume, it was the intimacy. He had taken these over decades, quietly, carefully, while I was at my most vulnerable, unaware, unguarded. I didn't know what I was looking at. Was it devotion, madness, possession? Then I noticed the journal. It was tucked beneath the bookshelf, half hidden under a stack of papers, leather-bound, worn at the edges. I opened it with the same kind of dread you feel peeling back a hospital curtain. The pages were dated and structured like a logbook, but every entry followed the same theme. She looked peaceful tonight. Her hand twitched in her sleep. I wonder what she was dreaming about. She doesn't know I see her this way. I hope she never does. Entry after entry for years, and that's when something began to unravel. Broke open inside me because for all the years I thought he didn't see me, it turned out he saw everything. Not the version of me I gave the world, not the woman in makeup and polite smiles. He watched the version of me I never gave away, the one who let her guard down only in sleep. But he never said it, never shared it, never turned that attention into love or connection. He hoarded it. He watched me live my life silently, obsessively, and let me believe I was invisible. He captured me not to cherish me, but to possess me without my knowing. And that realization didn't bring comfort. It brought rage because love should make you feel safe, and this felt like surveillance. This wasn't romance. This was a prison. I left the room that night not with answers, but with the final proof that I had never been loved in the way I deserved. I had been kept, observed, collected, but never truly known. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, though maybe part of me was, but mostly because I couldn't stop thinking. Not in panic spirals or tears, but with a quiet, eerie clarity, like when fog lifts from a lake and you suddenly see the bottom. I sat on the edge of the bed, the journal open on my lap, staring at the words Russell had written over the years. So many entries, so many nights he had stood inches from my face, camera in hand, while I lay there completely unaware, vulnerable, unprotected. The entries weren't cruel. That's what made it worse. They were soft, thoughtful, admiring even, but not once did he write about what I had said that day, what I'd laughed at, struggled with, hoped for. Not once did he mention the sound of my voice or the curve of my opinions, only the way I looked when I didn't know I was being watched. That was his version of love, and that's when the shift began. Because for the first time in years, I stopped asking what he meant. I stopped interpreting, excusing, translating his silence into something palatable. I stopped making space for the benefit of the doubt. Instead, I started asking what I had lost, what I had given away in tiny increments, day after day, year after year, in exchange for what? A house, a schedule, a quiet man who studied me like an object in a glass case? No, that wasn't love. That was containment, and I wasn't going to be contained anymore. The next morning, I opened all the windows in the house, every single one. I let the air in, real moving air, and it stirred the curtains like a breath. I pulled the sheets off our bed, my bed now, and stripped the house of its stale scent. I found an old playlist from my 30s, full of songs Russell would have scoffed at, and I let them play loud enough that Toby cocked his head, puzzled. For the first time in years, I danced while I vacuumed. Not joyfully, not yet, but defiantly. Later that day, I went to the library, not the one where I used to work, but the smaller branch 2 towns over. I didn't want to be recognized. I didn't want to explain anything. I just wanted to sit among books and feel like I belonged somewhere again. I found a seat in the back and opened my notebook, the one I used to fill with poems. The pages were still blank, but my hand didn't shake this time. I began to write slowly, one line, then another. It wasn't a masterpiece, it didn't need to be. It just needed to be mine. Over the next few days, I started making lists. Not chore lists, not grocery lists, but real ones. Things I gave up without realizing, teaching my painting class, asking questions, my voice at the dinner table. Things I want to do before 65, take a solo trip, read 100 books, write a collection of poems even if no one reads them, sleep in the middle of the bed. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It wasn't even justice. It was a return to myself. The most surprising moment came one afternoon when I looked in the mirror, not to check my hair or my wrinkles, but just to look, really look. And I saw her, not the woman from the photos, not the peaceful sleeper, but the one who was waking up. I smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't triumphant, but it was real. No one knew what I was doing, not Mara, not Clara, not the neighbors who waved as they walked their dogs past the house each morning, not the old book club friends who still sent me polite messages asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. That was the point. For the first time in decades, I was doing something just for me, and I wasn't asking anyone for permission. Russell had always handled our finances, or so I told myself. The truth was I had allowed him to. I let him pay the bills, file the taxes, move money between accounts, not because I couldn't, but because I was told subtly over years that it was easier that way, that I didn't need to bother. But now, alone in that quiet house with only Toby trailing behind me, I opened the old filing cabinet in the guest room closet. It was dented and dusty, the key long gone, but I jimmied it open with a flathead screwdriver and a small burst of determination. Inside were folders, so many folders. Tax returns dating back 20 years, bank statements, insurance policies, even a handwritten list of passwords folded neatly behind a stapled I hadn't known existed. I read every line, and then I read them again. Russell had left everything to me, the house, the accounts, even the old stocks I didn't know he'd held on to from some company he once did contract work for in the 90s. On paper, I was comfortable, stable, but emotionally I was still digging myself out from under the weight of decades of quiet erasure, and that kind of rebuilding didn't come from bank balances. So I made a different kind of plan. Each day, I carved out time not to run errands or make lists for others, but to sit in stillness and ask myself a single question: what do I want? Now, some days the answer was small: a walk around the lake alone, a cup of coffee at the cafe Russell said was too noisy, a lavender candle lit before dinner, even though he always hated the smell. Other days it was bolder: a call to an old friend I hadn't seen since college, an online poem. Try class, a visit to the local community center to inquire about volunteering. Then came the idea, a quiet one at first, but it didn't leave me. Turn that office into something else. I didn't touch the photographs, not yet. They stayed where they were, like artifacts in a museum I hadn't finished cataloging. But I began to change the space around them. I opened the blinds, let in light. I removed Russell's desk chair and replaced it with a reading armchair from the den. I hung one of my old paintings, the first I ever made, a terrible but joyful still life of Peaches, on the opposite wall. I brought in a lamp with soft gold light and placed a small vase of dried eucalyptus on the shelf where his journal had once rested. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post about it. I didn't document it. It was my secret reclamation. Even Toby, sensing the shift, stopped hesitating at the threshold of the room. He'd curl up at my feet now while I sat with a notebook in my lap, the door open behind me, the walls no longer closing in. And every time I passed a mirror in the hallway, I noticed it again, that flicker behind my eyes. Not a fire, not yet, but a spark. I began keeping a different kind of journal, not like his, not full of observations about someone else. Mine was about me, what I felt, what I remembered, what I wanted. There were no plans to run, no declarations to the world, no grand speeches, just small steps, silent setups. I had spent years being the woman who folded napkins just right, who smiled when she was dismissed, who stepped lightly through her own home so as not to disturb her husband's mysterious quiet. But now I was making noise, not with words, but with presence. And I didn't need anyone to see it yet because I saw it, and that was enough to begin. Something began to change, not in them but in me. And when a woman changes, the world around her often doesn't know how to respond, at least not right away. It started small, a shift in tone, in posture, in what I chose to tolerate. I stopped answering questions I didn't want to. When Clara called and asked, "Are you doing okay? Are you lonely?" I no longer offered the polite, "I'm fine." I said, "I'm figuring things out," and let the silence hang there. I didn't rush to fill it. When Mara called one morning and said, "I've been thinking maybe you should sell the house." "It's too much for you," I said calmly. "No, it's not." Then I changed the subject. She paused, surprised. I had spent so many years cushioning my words, phrasing things so carefully so no one would feel uncomfortable. Now I didn't bother, not out of anger, but because I no longer felt responsible for other people's ease. And people noticed. One afternoon, I attended a small neighborhood gathering, a book exchange, and lunch in the backyard of an acquaintance named Linda. These were women I'd known in the periphery for years. They were friendly, always smiling, but I never truly felt like I belonged. I always played the part of Russell's wife, the polite one, the one who brought fruit salad and laughed at jokes I didn't find funny. But this time, I wore a soft crimson blouse I hadn't worn in years, one Russell once called too loud. I wore it because I liked how it looked in the mirror, because it reminded me I was still here. Someone made a passive remark about aging, about how we become invisible after 60, and without thinking, I replied, "Only if you let yourself be." A few women chuckled. One looked startled. Linda raised her wine glass and said, "Well, damn, Evelyn." The conversation moved on, but I felt it, the shift that I wasn't just there. I was present. Later, I caught a glimpse of myself in the sliding glass door, a reflection framed by hydrangeas and wind chimes, and I didn't look small. I didn't look lost. I looked like someone I'd forgotten. Back at home, I continued the quiet rebuilding. I opened the old bank account in my name that Russell had left untouched for years. I reactivated my teaching credentials just in case I wanted to tutor. I even called the local art center and asked about joining a community poetry reading. I didn't sign up yet, but I asked. Each action, invisible to most, was a tile in the mosaic of a woman reclaiming her life. Even Toby changed. He no longer waited at the front door for footsteps that would never return. He followed me more closely now, sitting beside me in the evenings as I read by the fire. Sometimes I swore he watched me like he was seeing me for the first time. The house felt lighter. Even the silence inside it changed. It wasn't haunted anymore, not with unspoken words or locked doors. It was quiet because I chose quiet. It was clean because I wanted it that way. For the first time, everything around me felt like it belonged to me, not to the ghost of someone else's control. And here's the thing about power. Real power doesn't need an audience. It doesn't shout. It moves slowly with intention, like air through open windows, like ink across a page. I hadn't told anyone what I found in that room. Not the photos, not the journal. I didn't need to. The power wasn't in the reveal. It was in the knowing. I carried that truth like a steady flame behind my ribs, not to burn, just to light the way. And that light was starting to shine through. People looked at me differently now, with curiosity, maybe even a little unease. Not because I said anything sharp, but because I wasn't the version of me they remembered, the one who smiled quietly, who looked to her husband for cues. That woman had faded, and the woman standing in her place, she wasn't loud, she wasn't angry, but she was awake, and they could feel it. It wasn't planned. I didn't wake up that morning thinking, today's the day I tell them everything. In fact, I was sipping my tea by the window, still wearing my house robe, watching a bird peck at the feeder when the phone rang. It was Mara. "Hey, Mom," she said. "David and I are coming into town this weekend. We were thinking maybe we'd stay at the house." I hesitated. "What for?" "We just miss you," she said, "and I thought we could. I could go through some of Dad's things. You've been holding on to everything for months. Maybe it's time to start letting some of it go." There it was again, that soft push wrapped in concern, but built on the assumption that I was still the woman who needed steering, and I realized I wasn't anymore. "All right," I said, "come Sunday, lunch is at noon." She paused, surprised by my decisiveness. "Okay, great." When Sunday arrived, I didn't cook. I ordered lunch from a Mediterranean restaurant Russell would have hated. "Too many spices," he used to say. I set the table with my mother's old china, not because it was a special occasion, but because I wanted it to be beautiful for me. Mara and David arrived with cautious smiles and a bottle of wine. We sat, we ate, we made light conversation, mostly about their wedding plans and David's new job. But I could feel it building, that inevitable moment when someone brings up Russell's things. And sure enough, as we cleared the plates, Mara leaned back in her chair. "Mom," she said gently, "we should really think about what to do with Dad's office." I set down my fork. She continued, "I know it's hard, but I think holding on to all of it, the files, the photos, it might be keeping you stuck. We could go through it together." I looked at her, then at David, who was trying to smile supportively but clearly wanted no part of this conversation. So I stood up. "Come with me," I said. They followed, confused but quiet, as I walked down the hallway. I stopped at the office door and opened it without hesitation. The room was no longer dim or closed. Sunlight poured in through the opened blinds. The furniture had been rearranged, and my eucalyptus vase stood quietly on the shelf beside my notebook. They stepped in behind me. "What's this?" Mara asked, brow furrowed. I walked over to the wall and removed one of the boxes, the one labeled Evelyn 2001 to 2005. I opened the lid, pulled out a stack of photos, and handed them to her. She flipped through them slowly at first, then faster. "These are Mom. These are all of you." "Yes," I said. "Sleeping?" I nodded. I watched her expression change from confusion to discomfort and then to something like horror. She handed them to David, who glanced down, then looked up quickly, unsure what to say. "There are hundreds more," I said softly. "Framed, filed, dated." He took them over decades. Mara looked stunned. "Why would he?" "I don't know," I said. "I don't think I'll ever fully understand. But this is what he chose to see, not my thoughts, not my voice, just my stillness, my absence of awareness. That was what mattered to him." Mara covered her mouth. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. My voice didn't crack. I stood in the center of that room, the same room I once feared, the one that made me question my worth, and I felt none of that now. I felt whole. "This room used to scare me," I told her, not because of what was in it, but because of what it meant, that for nearly 40 years, I was living next to someone who didn't really see me, only the version of me that didn't move, that didn't speak. Mara stepped closer. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I didn't know what to do with it," I said. "But now I do." I walked over to my notebook on the chair, opened it to a page marked with a ribbon, and handed it to her, a poem, just a small one about reclaiming space, about what it means to be awake. She read it in silence. When she looked back at me, her eyes were glassy. "You wrote this." "I did." And just like that, the room once filled with secrets now held something new, truth, not shouted, not forced, but laid bare. For the first time, I wasn't being watched, I was being heard. 3 days after Mara and David left, I stood alone in Russell's former office with the sunlight spilling across the walls, touching the photos that were still there. I had made a decision, not out of revenge, not to punish, but to reclaim, to transform this bizarre obsessive archive into something else, something that served me, something that told my story. I reached out to an old college acquaintance, Naomi, an artist who had gone on to run a nonprofit gallery space in the city. We hadn't spoken in years, but I remembered how she once said, "Art should come from discomfort, from rawness, from what we can't explain." So I called her. I didn't explain everything on the phone, just enough. "I have something," I said, "a body of work. It's unconventional, intimate, and I think it matters." She invited me to bring it in. 2 weeks later, I stood in that gallery, smaller than I remembered, tucked between a laundromat and a bakery, with Naomi and 2 of her curators watching as they unpacked the first box of photographs. They were silent for a long time. Then one of them whispered, "This is haunting. It's obsessive." The other added, "But it's also strangely tender." "It's both," I said, "and it wasn't created for an audience. That's what makes it so disturbing." Naomi nodded. "This isn't just photography, it's a psychological portrait," I told her. I didn't want my name on it, not on the wall, not on the press release. I didn't want to be a headline or a spectacle. I just wanted the truth to exist outside the 4 walls it had been trapped in for decades. We called it Sleeping Woman, observed without permission. The gallery displayed them in a narrow room, the way Russell had, no commentary, just the images printed as they were, lined up by date. They added a single line to the program, a private devotion never meant to be shared and perhaps never meant to be loved. It opened quietly, no fanfare, no champagne, just a low hum of curious visitors wandering in and out. But then it spread. A local journalist came to write a small review, then another. Soon, art blogs were reposting images with headlines like "Obsession or Affection," the mystery behind the Sleeping Woman exhibit. She was watched for 30 years without knowing. Now her silence is on display. I didn't read the comments. I didn't give interviews, but I saw the faces of the people who walked through the exhibit: confusion, sadness, fascination, unease, and above all, recognition. They saw the truth, not about Russell, but about me, about how easy it is for a woman to be present and still never truly be known. Mara visited alone weeks after the opening. I didn't go with her. I waited for her call. When she finally rang, her voice cracked through the receiver. "Mom, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," I said. "Just tell me what you saw." She was quiet for a while. Then I saw a woman disappear in front of a camera for 30 years, and I saw her come back to life at the end. That night, I sat in my garden, the one Russell never cared to walk through, and I lit a small candle beside my notebook. Not for him, not in mourning, but as a marker, a line drawn in flame between what was and what will never be again. This was my justice, not in a courtroom, not in a confrontation, but in reclamation. He had watched me in silence. Now the world watched him watching me, and I wasn't afraid anymore. It was early spring when Mara asked if she could visit again. Just the two of us. There was no agenda this time, no boxes to sort through, no pressure to process anything. She simply said, "I want to spend time with you, not the past, just you." So I said yes. She arrived with a homemade strawberry pie and that same nervous energy she used to carry as a teenager right before she confessed something, like the time she broke a window with a soccer ball and waited 2 days to tell me. We sat on the porch with mugs of tea, the garden just starting to bloom behind us, daffodils, tulips, and the early promises of hydrangeas all growing without needing anyone's permission. I watched her study me when she thought I wasn't looking. Her eyes lingered on my face a little too long, like she was trying to match this version of me with the one she remembered or the one she had constructed from decades of quiet expectations. "I saw the exhibit twice," she said suddenly, "once alone and once with a friend." I didn't tell her it was you. I just wanted to see what it felt like to witness it without context. I sipped my tea. "And what did it feel like?" She paused. "Like grief, but not just for the woman in the pictures, for the version of myself who never saw her." I nodded slowly, not to comfort her, but to acknowledge the weight of her honesty. She looked down at her hands. "I keep thinking about all the times I told you how lucky you were that Dad was so stable, so dependable. I used to brag about you too. I thought you were boring in a good way." I smiled softly. "So did I." That made her laugh, the real kind, the kind that escapes before you can decide whether or not it's appropriate. "I feel like I missed who you really were," she said. "I was so busy learning how to be your daughter that I never got to know you as a person." I didn't reach for her hand. I didn't rush to reassure her because I didn't need to be needed anymore. "I let that happen," I said gently. "I played the role I was given, the good wife, the quiet mother, the patient hostess. I wore it like a second skin." "But you weren't just that," she said. "No," I replied, but I didn't realize it until it was almost too late. She blinked back tears. "I want to know you now," she said, "not the version from the past, just who you're becoming." I looked out at the garden where the wind was moving softly through the lavender stems. "I'm still figuring that out, but I can tell you this. I like her. She's curious, she's not afraid to take up space, and she doesn't apologize for being awake." Mara exhaled something like relief, spreading across her shoulders. "I think I could learn from her." I turned to her, this woman I had raised, who now looked at me not with expectation but with respect, and I said, "You already are." We didn't make a promise that day to fix everything. There was no dramatic embrace or long tearful apology, just a shared meal, a long walk through the garden, and a quiet understanding that relationships, like people, can grow again if you let them root in truth. Before she left that evening, she stood in the doorway and said, "I've been writing too, just little things, nothing fancy." I smiled. "Share one with me sometime." "I will," she said, "and Mom, I'm proud of you." I didn't cry, not because I wasn't moved, but because I didn't need those words to validate anything. They were beautiful, but they weren't necessary. I was already proud of myself, not for surviving, but for choosing to live. And in that moment, as the door clicked shut behind her, I realized something. I no longer needed to be remembered a certain way. I just needed to be real. The house is still, but not the kind of stillness that once haunted me, not the hollow, heavy quiet of being watched or forgotten. This silence is different. It's chosen, it's clean, it's mine. It's morning early. The sun is just starting to slip over the ridge, brushing gold against the tops of the trees outside my window. I'm sitting in the garden with Toby asleep at my feet, A blanket wrapped around my shoulders and a steaming mug of lavender tea in my hands, something Russell would have called pointless water, but I like it. The scent, the way it settles into me like a lullaby in reverse, not putting me to sleep, but waking me gently. Every sip reminds me I'm still here, still changing. Across the yard, my hydrangeas are blooming, thick, proud bursts of blue and violet and cream. I planted them long ago, but this is the first season I've watched them bloom without asking anyone else's opinion on how they should look. They're imperfect, a little wild, and absolutely beautiful, just like me. I've stopped organizing my days around usefulness. I don't measure my value by who I've helped or what I've accomplished by noon. Some mornings I write for hours, other days I sit by the window and do nothing but exist, and I no longer feel guilty for that. The old photos still exist. I didn't destroy them, I didn't burn the journals. They remain in a single box in the back of my closet, not because I want to revisit them, but because they're a part of the truth, a part of my story. But they no longer hold power over me. They're relics, artifacts of a life I once lived, asleep in more ways than one. Now I wake early because I want to. I walk barefoot through the grass, dirt between my toes, because I like the way it reminds me I'm not above the earth. I'm part of it. Sometimes I reread my own words, and it feels like I'm meeting someone again after years apart. Someone brave, someone thoughtful, someone who never really left. She was just quiet, waiting, watching, learning the shape of the cage before she pushed it open. And now that she's out, she will never go back in. Mara calls often, not out of obligation, but because she wants to. We talk about real things: memory, fear, growth. She sends me her little poems, scribbled in the margins of her work notes. Some are sweet, some are heavy. All of them are hers, and she shares them not as my daughter, but as a woman standing across from me, finally seeing me for who I am. Clara and I have started walking together again, like we did when we were girls. She doesn't ask questions. She knows I won't answer. She just shows up wearing a bright windbreaker, holding 2 thermoses of strong coffee, and we walk the old trail by the lake in comfortable silence. People have stopped asking me if I'm okay. Maybe because they can tell I am. Maybe because I no longer wear pain like perfume. Maybe because I no longer need anyone else to name what I've already claimed. Some nights I light a single candle in the corner of the office, now my writing room, and I write a line, just one, that captures the day. Yesterday's entry was, "I didn't shrink today." That's enough. I don't need sweeping declarations or dramatic endings. My life is not a story being wrapped up with a ribbon. It's one being unspooled thread by thread, gently and for the first time on my terms. As the sun rises higher, I close my notebook and run a hand across Toby's back. He stirs, stretches, and settles again. I smile. This is peace, not the peace I once pretended to have, the tidy kind made of compliance and silence, but the real kind, the kind you earn when you choose yourself again and again, every day, even when no one's watching, especially